Montana Territory, 1878. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the dust-speckled windows of Copper Creek's only post office, illuminating the weathered face of Joshua Zane as he squinted at the wire in his hands. At 25, Joshua had already spent 7 years working his father's ranch alone, convinced that the brutal Montana frontier was no place for tenderness. The endless cycle of backbreaking work, harsh winters, and isolation had hardened him to the idea of companionship. A man survived out here through self-reliance, not soft feelings that only led to heartache. Mail-order brides arriving on tomorrow's stage, Postmaster Wilson announced, his voice carrying across the small office. Says here she's been rejected by the Miller family up north. Too old, apparently. He chuckled. Sending her back east unless someone claims her. Joshua shifted uncomfortably. Waste of a train ticket. His father's dying words echoed in his mind. This land will take everything you love. Better to love nothing but the land itself. He'd lived by those words, keeping the Double Z Ranch running through sheer determination and solitude. She'll be staying at Widow Cooper's boarding house until the eastbound train comes through next week, Wilson added, sliding the notice across the counter. Shame. Heard she paid her own way out here. Joshua glanced at the paper, an unfamiliar pang of empathy stirring beneath his ribs. A woman alone, rejected, with nowhere to go in a territory where unmarried women were as rare as rainstorms in August. Still, it wasn't his concern. The spring cattle drive was weeks away, and he had fences to mend before the snow fully melted. Not my problem, he muttered, tucking the ranch mail into his saddlebag. The next afternoon found Joshua in town for supplies, his wagon loaded with seed for spring planting and tools for repairs. He'd meant to avoid the stagecoach's arrival, but the timing had worked against him. As he secured the last crate, commotion erupted around the dusty main street as the four-horse coach thundered into view. He told himself he wasn't watching for her, but when the stagecoach door swung open and a slender figure emerged, Joshua found himself unable to look away. Jasmine Lockwood stepped onto Montana soil with trembling legs and squared shoulders. At 23, she wore a practical blue traveling dress that had once been fashionable back east, her honey blonde hair swept into a simple bun beneath a modest hat. The journey had left smudges of exhaustion beneath her clear blue eyes, but there was a quiet dignity in how she surveyed the town that had just become her temporary prison. Joshua watched as Widow Cooper approached the young woman, speaking in hushed tones. The woman's face remained composed, but even from a distance, he could see the slight slump of her shoulders. Too old at 23? The absurdity of it struck him suddenly. Old Man Miller was nearing 60 himself and had likely expected a girl barely 16. Something about her solitary figure, standing amid her trunks as the townsfolk stared and whispered, sparked an unexpected feeling in Joshua's chest. Here was someone else who understood abandonment. Need help with those trunks, ma'am? The words left his mouth before he'd made any conscious decision to speak. Jasmine turned, assessing the tall, broad-shouldered man with cautious eyes. His face was sun-bronzed but younger than she'd expected, with clean features and clear hazel eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. I wouldn't want to trouble you, sir, she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of Boston education. No trouble. Joshua found himself lifting the heavier of her trunks. Headed to Widow Cooper's, I expect? Yes, she answered, then added with quiet dignity. Just until next week's train. Then I'll be returning east. Heard about Miller, Joshua said, then immediately regretted his bluntness when he saw her cheeks flush. Man's a fool, he added gruffly. It seems I wasn't what was expected, she said carefully. They'd requested someone younger. You seem plenty young to me, Joshua replied, then reddened at his own boldness. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. 23 is apparently ancient in bride years. They walked in silence to the boarding house, where Widow Cooper stood waiting on the porch. Joshua carried the trunk inside, setting it carefully beside the narrow bed in the small room that would be Jasmine's temporary home. Thank you, mister? Jasmine inquired. Zane. Joshua Zane. I run the Double Z Ranch about 5 miles east of town. Miss Jasmine Lockwood, she replied with a small curtsy that seemed oddly formal and vulnerable at once. He nodded awkwardly, suddenly aware of the trail dust on his clothes and the calluses on his hands. Ma'am, the encounter should have ended there. a brief moment of courtesy before they returned to their separate fates. But as Joshua stepped back onto the porch, something made him pause. "Miss Lockwood," he called back. "I'm taking supper at the hotel restaurant tonight. Around 6. They serve decent stew on Thursdays." He touched the brim of his hat and was gone before she could respond. Joshua spent the afternoon questioning his impulsive invitation. He'd avoided town socials and dances for years, preferring the honest company of his horses and cattle to the complexities of human interaction. Yet here he was, changing into his one good shirt and actually running a comb through his sun-streaked brown hair. He arrived at the hotel restaurant early, half hoping she wouldn't come, half fearing the same. When she appeared in the doorway, wearing the same blue dress but with her hair freshly arranged, he rose so quickly he nearly upset the water glasses. "I wasn't certain I understood correctly," Jasmine said as she took the seat across from him. "But I appreciate the invitation." Widow Cooper means well, but her questioning was becoming rather thorough. "Town small. News travels fast," Joshua acknowledged. "Especially news like," he stopped himself. "Like a mail-order bride deemed too elderly at 23? She finished for him, a flash of hurt crossing her features before she composed herself. "Yes, I imagine that's quite the sensation." The awkwardness between them gradually eased as they shared the simple meal. Joshua found himself speaking more than he had in months, explaining the challenges of running the ranch alone since his father's passing 3 years earlier. "No family to help?" she asked. "None living," he replied. "My mother died when I was 12. Father never remarried." Said Montana winters froze a man's heart as surely as they froze the creek. "Yet you stayed." Joshua looked up, caught by the insight in her question. "It's my land. My responsibility. Is it enough?" she asked softly, then immediately shook her head. "Forgive me. That's too personal a question." "It has to be," he answered anyway. "A man can't expect more out here." As twilight deepened outside the window, Jasmine shared her own story, how her father's business failure and subsequent death had left her with few options in Boston, how she'd spent her small inheritance on the journey west, believing the letters from the Miller family that promised a respectable home and family. "I should have known," she said, twisting her napkin, "when they emphasized youth and childbearing above all else. But I convinced myself that 23 wasn't so very old." "It isn't," Joshua said firmly. "Miller wanted a servant, not a wife." Their conversation continued until the restaurant emptied around them. Joshua walked her back to the boarding house, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear Montana sky. "Thank you," Jasmine said as they reached the porch. "For dinner, and for not looking at me with pity." "No reason for pity," Joshua replied. "You're brave, coming all this way alone." "Or foolish," she countered with a sad smile. "Sometimes they look the same out here." He paused. "I could show you around tomorrow, if you'd like. Since you're here until next week anyway." Jasmine hesitated only briefly. "I would like that." The next day, Joshua arrived with his wagon, offering to show Jasmine the town and surrounding countryside. Their tour of Copper Creek took less than an hour. The general store, the small church, the blacksmith shop, and the newly constructed schoolhouse made up most of the settlement. Not much compared to Boston, Joshua acknowledged as they drove beyond the town limits. "But beautiful in its own way," Jasmine replied, gazing at the distant mountains rising purple against the horizon. "There's a vastness here that makes everything else seem small." He glanced at her, surprised by how precisely she'd captured his own feelings about the territory. "That's why I stay," he admitted. "Even when the winters are brutal and the work nearly breaks me." As they crested a hill, the landscape opened before them, revealing a valley where spring runoff had transformed the brown plains into patches of green. In the distance stood a modest 2-story house beside several outbuildings, a corral with horses moving lazily in the afternoon sun. "The Double Z," Joshua said, an unexpected pride in his voice. "My father built the house. I added the north wing and the new barn 2 years back." "It's lovely," Jasmine said sincerely. "A proper home." Something in her tone made Joshua look at her more closely. "Would you like to see it?" The house was simple but solid, with a large kitchen and comfortable, if sparse, furnishings. Joshua watched nervously as Jasmine moved through the rooms, her fingers trailing over the handmade furniture, pausing at the empty spaces on walls and shelves where a woman's touch might have added comfort. "You've kept it very neat," she observed. Try to, he said awkwardly. No point in living in squalor just because, he broke off. Because you're alone, she finished quietly. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Joshua felt something shift in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. Before he could examine the feeling, a commotion outside drew their attention. One of his ranch hands, young Tommy Wilson, came running toward the house. Mr. Zane, that old bull broke through the south fence again, heading straight for Pearson's wheat fields. The peaceful afternoon shattered. Joshua apologized hurriedly and promised to return Jasmine to town after the crisis. To his surprise, she didn't request to be taken back immediately. May I watch? She asked instead. I've never seen actual ranching work. For the next 2 hours, Jasmine observed from a safe distance as Joshua and his men worked to herd the massive bull back toward the proper pasture. His horsemanship was impressive, his commands to both animal and men clear and confident. This was a different Joshua than the somewhat awkward man who had shared dinner with her. Here was someone in his element, capable and assured. When they finally secured the fence and returned to the house, Jasmine had a pot of coffee waiting, having taken the liberty of using his kitchen. Hope you don't mind, she said as the men gratefully accepted the hot drinks. Seemed the least I could do. Joshua watched as she moved comfortably around his kitchen, filling cups and offering the cornbread she'd found and warmed. The ranch hands cast curious glances between them, but knew better than to comment directly. As dusk approached, Joshua drove Jasmine back to town, the wagon rolling slowly under a sky painted in dramatic strokes of orange and purple. Thank you for today, she said. I've never seen anything like your ranch. It's not much, he replied automatically. It's everything, she corrected him. A home you've built, land you care for, work that matters. Joshua fell silent, struck by her perception. When they reached the boarding house, he found himself reluctant to say goodbye. There's a social at the church tomorrow evening, he said suddenly. Nothing fancy, just the townsfolk getting together for music and food. Jasmine looked hesitant. I'm not sure I should, given my situation. All the more reason, Joshua insisted. Better than sitting alone at Widow Cooper's while she clucks over you like a hen with one chick. A genuine laugh escaped her, brightening her features. You make a compelling argument, Mr. Zane. Joshua, he corrected. If you're going to be my guest at a social, you ought to use my given name. Joshua, she repeated softly. Then I'm Jasmine to you. The church social was a modest affair by Eastern standards, but to the isolated community of Copper Creek, it was an important occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over trestle tables laden with food brought by the townsfolk. A small group of musicians played lively tunes while children darted between the adults and young couples found excuses to slip outside into the spring evening. Joshua had not attended a social in over 2 years, and his arrival with Jasmine caused a ripple of curious glances and whispers. He stiffened, regretting subjecting her to more gossip, but Jasmine met the stares with poised dignity. Miss Lockwood, Widow Cooper approached immediately. I didn't expect to see you here tonight. Mr. Zane was kind enough to invite me, Jasmine replied evenly. Since I'll be departing soon, I thought I should see more of your lovely community. Several of the town's women gathered, their curiosity barely disguised as welcome. Joshua watched with growing admiration as Jasmine fielded their questions with grace, neither revealing too much about her situation nor appearing ashamed. She handles them better than a seasoned cowhand handles a spooked herd, remarked Sheriff Parker, appearing at Joshua's side. She shouldn't have to, Joshua replied, a protective edge in his voice that surprised him. The sheriff studied him thoughtfully. Known her long, have you? Just a few days. The older man sipped his punch. Interesting few days, I'd guess. Before Joshua could respond, the music changed to a waltz, and several couples moved to the cleared space in the center of the room. Without consciously deciding to, Joshua found himself crossing to where Jasmine stood. Would you care to dance? He asked, extending his hand. Surprise flickered across her face before she placed her hand in his. I'd be delighted. Joshua hadn't danced since his school days, but his body remembered the simple steps. Jasmine moved with the natural grace of someone who had learned dancing as part of her education, gently guiding without seeming to whenever he faltered. Everyone's watching, she murmured as they turned. Let them, he replied. Gives them something new to talk about besides cattle prices and weather. Her answering smile warmed something cold and long dormant inside him. As they circled the floor, the rest of the room seemed to recede, leaving just the two of them moving in harmony. "When does your train leave?" he asked suddenly. "Tuesday morning," she replied, her smile fading slightly. 5 days from now. 5 days. The brevity struck Joshua with unexpected force. 5 days before she would return east, leaving Copper Creek, and him, behind. The thought left an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. The following days developed a pattern. Joshua would complete his essential ranch work early, then drive into town to spend time with Jasmine. They explored the countryside, shared meals, and talked for hours. He found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced aloud. His hopes for expanding the ranch, his fears of failing the legacy his father had left, his memories of a mother whose face grew dimmer with each passing year. Jasmine, in turn, spoke of her life in Boston, of the security she'd known before her father's business collapsed, of the painful adjustments that had followed, how she'd eventually accepted the Millers' offer as her best hope for a new beginning. "I wasn't naive enough to expect love," she admitted as they sat by the creek that ran through Joshua's property. "Just respect and perhaps, eventually, companionship." "You deserve more than that," Joshua said quietly. She smiled sadly. "What we deserve and what life offers aren't always aligned." On Sunday, they attended church together, ignoring the speculative glances from the congregation. Afterward, Joshua invited her to the ranch for dinner, which he prepared himself, a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread he'd purchased from the baker's wife. As they sat at his kitchen table, the domesticity of the scene struck Joshua forcibly. How natural it felt to have her across from him. How the house seemed warmer with her presence. How he found himself thinking of improvements he might make. Curtains for the windows, perhaps, or a proper garden outside the kitchen door. "You're quiet tonight," Jasmine observed. "Thinking," he admitted. "About?" He hesitated. "About how the train leaves in 2 days." "Yes," she said softly. "I've been trying not to count the hours." Their eyes met across the table, and Joshua saw his own reluctance mirrored in her gaze. The connection between them had grown so quickly, so unexpectedly, that neither had been prepared for what it might mean, or for how it would feel to sever it. "You could stay," he said abruptly. Jasmine's eyes widened. "Stay." "In Copper Creek," he clarified, suddenly uncertain. Until you decide what you want to do next." "And what would I do here?" she asked carefully. "Where would I live?" Joshua took a deep breath. "You could stay here. At the Double Z." "As what, Joshua?" Her voice was gentle but direct. The question hung between them, demanding an answer that would change everything. Joshua had spent years convinced that the frontier was no place for attachment, that survival required independence above all else. Yet in less than a week, this woman had challenged every belief he'd used to protect himself. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Joshua rose and moved to the window, surprised to see 3 riders approaching in the gathering dusk. "Stay here," he instructed, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. From the porch, he recognized the lead rider, Martin Miller, Old Man Miller's son, a man known for his quick temper and sense of entitlement. "Zane," Miller called out, pulling his horse to a stop. "Heard you've been entertaining our property." Joshua stepped fully onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly. "Don't recall seeing your brand on any person, Miller." The man dismounted, his companions following suit. All 3 had been drinking, judging by their unsteady movements. "That woman was contracted to our family," Miller insisted. "Paid for her passage and everything. Just 'cause Pa thought she was too old don't mean she can just take up with the first rancher who offers." "Miss Lockwood isn't taking up with anyone," Joshua replied coldly. "And she's not property to be claimed or discarded. You'd best ride back to your own land." Miller took a step forward. "Word is you're sweet on her. Thinking maybe you're planning to keep what we paid for." Joshua's grip tightened on his rifle. "Miss Lockwood makes her own decisions. And she's my guest tonight, which means you're trespassing. I won't ask you again to leave." "Or what?" Miller sneered. "You'll shoot us for coming to claim what's rightfully." The door opened behind Joshua, and Jasmine stepped onto the porch. "I believe I can speak for myself, Mr. Miller." Her quiet dignity seemed to momentarily disarm the men. She moved to stand beside Joshua, her presence straight and unafraid. "Your father rejected me," she stated clearly. Said I was too old at 23 to be a suitable bride. That releases any obligation on either side. I owe you nothing. Miller's face darkened. We spent good money bringing you out here. And I spent my entire savings believing your family's promises, she countered. I believe that makes us even. For a tense moment, Joshua thought Miller might try something foolish. The man's hand hovered near his belt where a pistol was holstered. Joshua shifted slightly, positioning himself more directly between Jasmine and potential danger. This ain't over, Miller finally spat, but he retreated to his horse. Pa will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Joshua replied steadily. They watched as the three riders departed, waiting until they disappeared into the darkening landscape before relaxing. I'm sorry, Joshua said, turning to Jasmine. I didn't expect them to come here. It's not your fault, she assured him. But perhaps I should return to town. I wouldn't want to cause you trouble. No, he said firmly. Miller's all bluster. But I'll drive you back if that's what you want. Jasmine hesitated, then shook her head. What I want? She paused, gathering her courage. What I want is to finish our conversation. You asked me to stay, and I asked you as what? The confrontation with Miller had crystallized something in Joshua's mind. The fierce protectiveness he'd felt, the certainty that he would defend her without hesitation, the absolute clarity that having her in his life mattered more than any principle of self-reliance he'd clung to for years. As my wife, he said plainly, if you'll have me. Jasmine's breath caught. Joshua, we've known each other less than a week. And in that time, I've told you things I've never told another soul, he replied. I've seen how you handle yourself with dignity, even when treated poorly. I've watched you take to ranch life with curiosity instead of complaint. I've felt what it's like to have you in this house, and I don't want to go back to how it was before. He took her hands in his. I'm not a rich man, Jasmine. The ranch keeps me busy from sunup to sundown most days. But it's a good life, and I think we could build something real together. Tears glistened in her eyes. What if it doesn't work? What if you decide I'm not suited to ranch life after all? Then we'll figure it out together, he promised. But I don't think that will happen. I think you belong here. With me. Jasmine looked up at him, searching his face. My train leaves Tuesday morning. It can leave without you, Joshua said softly. Or you can be on it. I won't force your choice. But I'm asking you to stay. To be mine. The moment stretched between them, fragile and momentous. Then Jasmine stepped forward, closing the distance. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. I'll be yours. Their first kiss was tentative, then deepening with shared certainty. When they finally pulled apart, Joshua rested his forehead against hers. I should take you back to town tonight, he said reluctantly. For propriety's sake. Jasmine nodded, though her hands remained clasped with his. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll speak to Reverend Adams about a wedding. As soon as he can arrange it. So quickly, she asked, though her smile betrayed her approval. I've spent enough years alone, Joshua replied. I don't intend to waste a single day more. True to his word, Joshua spoke with Reverend Adams the following morning. The news spread quickly through Copper Creek. Joshua Zane, the solitary rancher who'd avoided town gatherings for years, was marrying the mail-order bride rejected by the Millers. Old Man Miller made noise about compensation for the train ticket, but Sheriff Parker quietly reminded him that abandoning a woman in a frontier town carried certain legal implications that he might not want examined too closely. The matter was dropped, though the Millers conspicuously avoided the small wedding held Wednesday afternoon in the Copper Creek church. Jasmine wore her blue traveling dress, freshly pressed, with wildflowers Joshua had gathered that morning woven into her honey blonde hair. Joshua wore his Sunday suit, nervously adjusting his collar as he watched her walk toward him on Sheriff Parker's arm, the lawman having offered to stand in for her father. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, exchanged before a surprisingly large gathering of townsfolk who had decided the unusual courtship was both romantic and worthy of support. Widow Cooper dabbed her eyes repeatedly, declaring it the most touching ceremony she'd witnessed in 30 years. That evening, Joshua carried his bride across the threshold of the Double Z Ranch house, now their home together. In the soft lamplight, he looked at her with wonder. Having second thoughts? Jasmine asked softly. Only wondering how I got so lucky, he replied. When you stepped off that stagecoach, I had no idea you'd change everything. Everything, she echoed. I spent years believing that out here, a man could only rely on himself. That attachment was weakness, that the frontier was too harsh for anything tender to survive. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You proved me wrong in less than a week. Jasmine smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. And you showed me that sometimes what looks like the end of a dream is actually the beginning of a better one. Outside, the Montana night settled over the ranch, stars emerging in the vast sky above the land that had once seemed so empty to Joshua. Now, with Jasmine in his arms, he understood what had been missing all along. Not just companionship, but partnership. Someone to share both the burdens and the beauty of the life he'd built. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zane," he whispered against her lips. "I am home," she replied. "With you." In the years that followed, the Double Z Ranch prospered under their combined care. Jasmine planted the garden outside the kitchen door that Joshua had once imagined, added curtains to the windows, and filled the empty spaces with evidence of a life richly lived. Within 2 years, a daughter's cries joined the symphony of ranch sounds, followed by a son the year after. And when travelers passed through Copper Creek and remarked on the handsome family at the thriving Double Z Ranch, old-timers would sometimes tell the story of how Joshua Zane had claimed the mail-order bride rejected for being too old at 23, and in doing so, had found the perfect partner for the frontier life he'd once believed could only be endured alone.